Tonight, you're not scrolling or rehearsing tomorrow's worries. You're re-stepping through a gate that turns a city as unofficial needs into something countable, taxable, manageable, and therefore dangerous in a very quiet way. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch how a lantern street isn't just romance or music, but administration wearing perfume rules that decide who may enter, when doors close, what can be said, and what must stay contained. You'll feel how rank and distance become a product, how being unreachable can be priced like silk. And you'll see how debt can behave like a leash, soft at first, then impossible to unfasten. Even when nobody raises their voice, 3 small senses to keep you company. A paper lantern breathes like thin lungs and warm air. Get a tap on wet stone, precise and unhurried. A sliding door clicks shut with gentle finality, like punctuation. Something nearby keeps time, the same tap, the same breath, the same click over and over, until your mind decides it's safe to soften. Inhale 4, exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing only if you enjoy this calm kind of history. And in a whisper, tell me, where and what time are you listening from? Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a scandal shouted in the street. It begins with a gate, a single entrance that turns people into numbers, meetings into schedules, beauty into a ledger line, and makes a whole world feel private, while quietly ensuring it's never truly free. A paper lantern breathes in and out the way thin paper does when warm air and cool air keep negotiating. Get a tap on wet stone, not hurried, just precise, as if the street itself has a schedule. A sliding door clicks shut with that gentle finality that feels like punctuation. There is a strange comfort in the idea that a city can build a place for what it pretends it does not need, and then pretend, again, that building it was an act of moral cleanliness. In early modern Japan, the licensed pleasure quarters were a kind of urban compromise made out of wood, paper, and paperwork. The gate matters first, not because it is dramatic, but because it makes everything measurable. One gate means one entrance to count. One entrance means one list. And a list, as history keeps reminding us in its quieter moments, is basically the beginning of management. The quarter is contained, which is a polite word for we know where it is, and also for we can close it, and also, if we're being very sleepy and technical about it, for we can tax it. Inside, the rules don't feel like chaos at all. They feel like administration in soft clothing. Who may enter? When doors close. Which streets are for that and which are not for that, even though they are all objectively streets. It is the same strange logic as putting all your messy cables into one box and then calling the room organized. You have not solved the cables. You have relocated your anxiety. A lantern street is not only light, it is regulation wearing perfume. Someone decided at some point that pleasure could be routed like water through a channel, and that channel could be watched. Pleasure in this setting is not a storm. It is more like a municipal service that requires closing hours and a budget. There are guards and attendants and managers and neighbors who know what time the gate tends to creak. There are posted rules and unposted rules, and rules that exist only in the form of a raised eyebrow from someone who has been doing this longer than you have been alive. Even the architecture participates. Narrow lanes discourage wandering. Turned corners create little private pockets that are still, in a way, public. If you want a modern analogy, imagine an app that insists it is about community, but is also very serious about terms and conditions, and wants your location services turned on. Only here the terms are spoken, bowed into, poured into cups, and written into ledgers with brushes that make even bad news look elegant. Because after the gate, the next quiet machine is ranking. Names matter in the quarter the way labels matter on jars. They tell you where something belongs, how it should be handled, and how expensive it will feel to look at it. People are sorted into ranks because ranks control access, and access controls money, and money controls the kind of story you get to tell yourself later. A high-ranking courtesan could be marketed as art, which is a very human trick. You take something complicated, wrap it in poetry, and suddenly the payment sounds like taste. Music, conversation, calligraphy, the correct way to hold a fan without looking like you are trying too hard, these become part of what is purchased. Sometimes the thing being sold is not touch at all. Sometimes it is time, and the feeling of being chosen within a system built to make choosing difficult. The quarter sells distance on purpose. The more unreachable someone is, the more valuable the illusion becomes. In a very quiet way, it's like paying extra for priority boarding, even though the plane still leaves when it leaves. You are buying a small symbolic advantage, a gentle sense that you have stepped into a different category of person. And distance has its own manners. The way you bow, the way you wait, the way you speak, the way you pretend you did not rehearse what you are about to say, these are part of the transaction, and also part of the performance that protects everyone from saying the plain thing out loud. There are naming conventions that make people sound like seasons, or flowers, or weather, because ordinary names are too direct. There are house names, there are titles. There are rumors that function like advertisements, drifting down the street the way steam drifts from a bathhouse roof. Even the smallest details get used. Hair ornaments can signal rank. Fabric patterns can quietly announce who is allowed to stand where. If you are thinking, this sounds exhausting, it is. But exhaustion is sometimes the point. A system that is hard to navigate feels important. And importance is something people will pay for, preferably in installments. When you move deeper into the quarter's logic, you meet the softest leash it has, debt. Debt is quieter than violence, which is one reason it is so effective. It doesn't require shouting, it requires counting. Clothes, hairpieces, lessons, lodging, cosmetics, everything can be priced, recorded, and added to a total that follows a person like a polite shadow. In this world, beauty is not just a quality. It is an invoice with a ribbon tied around it. Training costs money. Maintenance costs money. Even the appearance of effortlessness can be itemized, which is almost funny, if you're in a mood to find humor and gentle absurdity. Imagine paying monthly for the privilege of looking like you don't have a monthly payment. The ledgers in these quarters were not abstract. They were physical objects with pages that made soft sounds when turned, with ink that dried the way small secrets dry slowly and then permanently. The quarter often relied on intermediaries too, which keeps the whole thing feeling like a network of half-knowledge. A seller rarely meets the client directly. A friend of a friend does the asking, a servant carries the message. An attendant interprets the mood. A manager remembers what was promised last time, or what was almost promised, which can be even more useful. No one holds the whole story, which means no one is fully responsible for it, which is a very old human design. You can request a solution for sleep, for anxiety, for loneliness, for the need to feel briefly admired without having to change your personality. And the vagueness is part of the product. Vagueness protects the buyer, the seller, and the messenger at the same time. In the math of the quarter, freedom is not a feeling, it is a number. And the number has a due date, or at least the impression of one, which can be just as effective. Then come the night agreements, those soft arrangements that don't always look like contracts, but behave like them anyway. The quarter governs meetings the way ritual governs prayer, scheduling, chaperones, approved rooms, and a careful awareness of who speaks to whom first. There are rules that protect workers, rules that protect clients, and rules that protect the business itself, which is quietly the most protected thing of all. Clients bring expectations the way people bring luggage. Status, secrecy, rivalry, the desire to be seen, the desire not to be seen, the desire to be remembered, the desire to pretend the whole thing was spontaneous. And the quarter turns those expectations into predictable profit. Promises are made in soft language patronage, exclusivity, rescue, future plans that keep someone hoping, because hope is surprisingly easy to bill for. Hope can be a contract even when nothing is signed, because a contract is sometimes just a shared misunderstanding that lasts long enough to become real. It's also worth noting, in a very sleepy and practical way, that the quarter is full of small workers who keep the big illusion running. Someone cleans, someone carries water, someone mends screens, someone keeps the lanterns from going out at the worst possible time, which in business is always the worst possible time. Someone is always listening for trouble, not out of moral concern, but out of operational concern. Trouble is bad for commerce, and commerce is what the quarter is underneath the poetry. There is a quiet, almost boring professionalism to it, which is not the kind of detail most dramatic retellings emphasize, because someone checked the schedule inside does not sound cinematic. But history, when you let it be boring, is full of size and schedules. If you want the quarter to feel even more like a machine, you can look at how it watches itself. The pleasure quarters often felt private, but they were full of eyes, managers, attendants, guards, neighbors, and the kind of gossip that behaves like a low-cost police force. Gossip is cheap. Gossip does not require uniforms. Gossip spreads through paper walls the way light spreads through chaussee screens, soft and unavoidable. A reputation can be controlled through rumor. A dispute can be handled by making sure everyone hears the same version of it first. And breaking rules brings consequences that aim to restore profit, not just as fines, confinement, reassignment, public shame. Public shame is particularly efficient because it makes the person being punished do some of the work. It is like outsourcing your discipline to the crowd. The system does not need to be cruel every day. It only needs to be unavoidable and predictable and quietly backed by people who know where you sleep. The rules also control the client, which is a detail people sometimes forget when they imagine only one direction of power. Not every rule protects workers, and not every rule protects clients, but most rules protect the system itself, which is the true resident of the quarter. Fights, unpaid tabs, kidnapping attempts, threats, these are bad for business, so they are managed fast. Even powerful men can be turned away if they disturb the balance the quarter depends on, because the quarter is a place where individual desires are allowed, only as long as they don't break the infrastructure. There is something strangely modern about that, too. Think of any place that tells you it values you as a customer, but will still remove you if you break the community guidelines. The Lantern Street offers pleasure, but it also offers boundaries, enforced by people who know the alleyways better than you do, and who have a financial incentive to keep the night running smoothly. And because the quarter is watched, it becomes strangely procedural. Who pours, who tastes, who touches the cup, which door opens first, where shoes are placed, how long someone is allowed to linger. The everyday becomes a series of small permissions. Even honest medicine can look suspicious when people believe invisible threats are everywhere, and the line between cure and harm is dosage and intent. In that atmosphere, life becomes managed through routine, and routine can feel like safety even when it's just repetition with a price tag. If you are listening while half asleep, you might notice that this is one of history's favorite tricks. Take something frightening, wrap it in procedure, and suddenly it feels tolerable. Not good, just tolerable. Like a long form you fill out because not filling it out would be worse. Later generations, of course, often remember the beauty first. Songs, prints, fashion, famous names, romantic rescues. The lantern glow becomes the whole story because a glow is easier to hold in your mind than a ledger full of numbers. Memory is selective in the way people are selective when they curate a photo album. You keep the flattering angles, and you quietly crop out the debt. But the truth, like most truths in history, is mixed. There was real skill. There was real artistry. There were real relationships, sometimes tender, sometimes strategic, sometimes simply familiar the way any repeated human contact becomes familiar. And there was also a system that could still be a trap, because systems that profit from limiting choice tend to remain limiting even when they are beautiful. History often keeps the lantern and forgets the lock on the gate, because the lantern makes a better souvenir. It's also easier to tell a story where control looks like culture. Order sounds nicer than restriction. Tradition sounds nicer than policy. Art sounds nicer than the price of distance. And this is not unique to Japan, or to any one century. Humans are very consistent about wrapping difficult structures in lovely language. We do it with job titles. We do it with luxury brands. We do it with the word exclusive, which is really just no wearing a nice coat. The pleasure quarters are a vivid example because the contrast is so clear. Soft light, hard math. Poetry paperwork. Music drifting through a corridor. And a manager at a desk with a brush adding numbers that do not care how beautiful the night feels. So if you want to hold the scene gently, hold it like a small candle that gives just enough light to see without waking you up. Rain on wood. Warm paper light. The quiet hum of a street that pretends to be effortless while dozens of people keep it running like a clock. Imagine the lanterns reflected in shallow puddles, each reflection trembling when a sandal steps too close. Imagine the scent of wet stone and incense, and somewhere not far away, a ledger closing with a soft thump that sounds almost polite. Hold the ledger too, if you can, not as a horror, but as a dull object that has simply always been there. Numbers, obligations, a life priced in installments, a door that doesn't open both ways. Tomorrow, if you tell this story, you can let it stay calm without becoming sweet. Beauty and control can share the same room. The lanterns dim the way tired eyes dim. The street quiets. The contracts remain, folded neatly where daylight won't look too closely. And if you're drifting now, you don't have to solve any of it. You can just listen to the soft sounds, the tap of gaeta on wet stone, the breathing paper of a lantern, the gentle click of a sliding door until the details blur into a kind of comfortable historical static, and the night keeps its careful procedural glow. You might not expect a single piece of paper to control how far your feet are allowed to go, but that is exactly the kind of quiet power paper enjoys. Not the dramatic kind, not the thunder and sword kind, the gentle kind. The kind that sits on a low desk, under a small lamp, waiting for you to spell your name correctly. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. A brush scratching, a sill pressing, a polite cough behind a screen. Somewhere, a gate creaks. Somewhere else, a travel pass is folded carefully into a sleeve like it's shy. So let's begin in a place that feels less like adventure and more like administration. Edo period Japan had roads that were busy, famous, and oddly tired. The great highways were not romantic ribbons across the landscape. They were practical corridors full of sandals, pack horses, bundles, and people pretending they are not sweating. And the first thing you learn very softly is that travel is not only movement, it is permission. You don't just decide to go. You arrange to be allowed to go, and the arrangement has its own rhythm. Someone writes down where you are from. Someone writes down where you claim you are going. Someone writes down who you are traveling with, because apparently loneliness is suspicious in a way that companionship isn't. And then there is the quiet question that floats under the ink like a watermark. Are you the sort of person who should be wandering? The documents themselves are almost boringly physical. They are not sleek. They are not laminated. They are paper, sometimes thicker, sometimes thin, sometimes folded so many times that the folds become a second kind of writing. The ink is black and a little glossy when fresh, then dull when it dries, which is a small historical comfort ink, has always been like that, refusing to be exciting. Seals matter too. A seal is a compressed piece of authority. It is a little stamp that says in a silent voice, someone important touched this. And the funny thing about seals is that they are both strong and fragile. Strong because a guard will trust them more than your face. Fragile because if the seal is smudged, or too light, or the wrong shape, your entire identity becomes a question you didn't plan for. If you are still awake when I start talking about where people kept their travel papers, tucked into sashes, wrapped in cloth, hidden in sleeves, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. It's fine. The road will keep going either way. The wind will still move through pine branches, and paperwork will still find you, even if you try to walk away from it politely. There's a sleepy absurdity to how travel papers transform a human being into a portable paragraph. You become a small text, a set of lines, a claim. And because the claim is written, it becomes real, in the way written things become real, even when they are slightly wrong. If you have ever filled out an online form and realized you are one typo away from becoming a stranger to your own bank account, you already understand the mood. It's the same gentle panic, just with more sandals. People learned how to speak about themselves in improved ways. A destination might be framed as a pilgrimage, because pilgrimage sounds cleaner than I want to go see my cousin and also eat noodles somewhere new. A purpose might be described as service, because service sounds tidy. Even leisure could be dressed up in respectable cloth. The road in this system does not ask you to be honest. It asks you to be legible, and then you reach the checkpoints. The Seika show. The gates that turn a road into a place where time slows down. Checkpoints are where travel becomes a performance, but a quiet one, like waiting your turn at a counter. There is a line. There is a low building. There are officials who have seen too many faces to remember any of them, which is an oddly soothing form of anonymity. Your papers are taken, looked at, and returned with the same calm you might use when handing someone a spoon. The official is not angry. The official is not curious in a personal way. The official is doing a job, and the job is to make sure your words match your ink. The questions are often simple, which is where the sleepiness becomes almost poetic. Where are you going? Where are you from? Who are you with? Why? And the why is the most delicate one, because it has to be answered without sounding like you are trying too hard. You want to be believable, not interesting. Interesting people get inspected. Boring people get waved through. This is one of history's small lessons that never gets old. If you wish to pass quietly, do not sparkle. Sparkling attracts attention, and attention attracts ink, and ink attracts problems. There are rules that hover around checkpoints like thin mist. One of the most famous anxieties involved movement that could change the political balance. Things like weapons, traveling in the wrong direction, or people traveling in the wrong category. Officials were trained to look for what didn't fit, which meant travelers were trained to fit. Clothing could become part of the disguise of normalness. Speech could become part of it. Even the speed of your answers mattered, because a pause can sound like lying even when it is just tiredness. And tiredness is everywhere on a road. People are always tired on roads. That's practically what roads are for, making you tired in a very organized way. Now imagine, very gently, that you make it through the gate. The barrier behind you becomes someone else's problem. The road widens again into something like freedom, but the freedom still has a ledger somewhere, quietly watching. Because after the checkpoint comes the next soft machine, lodging, inns, tea houses. Places where you take off your sandals and become a body again instead of a document. And even there, the paper returns. Many inns kept registers. Names, origins, sometimes occupations, sometimes the number of people in your group, sometimes notes that sound small and unimportant but can follow you like a faint scent. Arrived late, paid in full, carried a long box, talked too much. You don't have to imagine this as sinister. It's often just business. An inn wants to know who slept on which futon, because the inn lives in the real world where blankets get stained. And money goes missing, and people argue about whether they were served 2 bowls of rice or 3. The registers are a different kind of sleepy detail. The handwriting might be careful, or rushed, or neat in the way a person tries to be neat when they are doing the same task every day. Pages fill up. New pages begin. Ink gets lighter as the brush dries. It's all very human and very repetitive, which is exactly the kind of repetition that can make your mind drift. And within that repetition are tiny moments of absurdity. A traveler with a very long name. A traveler who can't write and has to press a thumbprint. A traveler who insists on a certain wording because he thinks it will make him sound important. The clerk doesn't care. The clerk just wants the line to move. Sometimes travel papers and in registers collide in a way that feels almost comical. Your official document says one thing, your in entry says another. Not because you're applauding, but because humans are inconsistent creatures who forget what they claimed 2 villages ago. The clerk writes what they hear. The document reflects what was approved. And you, the traveler, are the soft, messy center of it all, hoping that no one compares the versions too closely. There is a quiet art to staying consistent, and it is not the kind of art people write poems about. On the road, you also meet the informal economy of information. Gossip travels faster than people because gossip does not need rest stops. An innkeeper might share news with a checkpoint guard. A porter might mention a suspicious stranger. A vendor might recognize a face and say nothing, which is also a choice. In these networks, surveillance can be made out of ordinary conversation. It's not dramatic, it's not a spy movie. It's just humans being humans, noticing things, talking about them, and then pretending they didn't. If you want a modern analogy that stays soft, it is like being in a small town group chat where everyone somehow knows you bought a new lamp before the lamp even arrives. And yet, for all this watching, the road is still full of normal boredom. People complain about blisters. People argue about whether the noodles are better in one post town or another. People misplace small items and spend an hour looking for them as if the lost comb is a tragedy. Someone tells the same story again because it helps pass time. Someone else pretends to listen politely. This, too, is history. It is not all big moments. It is mostly small irritations and small routines, stitched together by footsteps. If you keep walking slowly, quietly, you begin to sense how travel restrictions shape imagination. When movement requires permission, destinations become heavier. A place you can't easily reach grows in your mind, not because it is magical, but because it is inconvenient. Inconvenience is excellent at producing longing. People plan around paperwork, families time visits, merchants calculate risk, pilgrims practice the right explanations, and some people simply don't go, which is the most ordinary outcome of all. Most lives in most centuries involve not going very far. Roads exist, but they are not equally available to everyone. That's a calm thought, in a way, because it means that staying put is not a personal failure. It's often just the default setting of history. There is also the strange psychological comfort of being processed. It sounds unpleasant, but it can be soothing in the way routines can be soothing. When you are checked, stamped, waved through, you become part of a system that pretends to be stable. The checkpoint says the world is organized. The inn register says the night is accounted for. The travel pass says you have a place in the order of things. Even if the order is restrictive, it still feels like order, and humans are easily comforted by order. This is why people like calendars. This is why people like receipts. This is why someone can feel calm just by watching a clerk stack papers neatly, even if those papers are technically about controlling them. Later, of course, history tends to romanticize the travel. The roads become legends. The post towns become charming. The pilgrimages become spiritual. Wood block prints capture the nice angles. The bridge, the mountain, the traveler with a hat that hides the sweat. And all of that is real in its way. But the prints don't usually show the moment where someone stands at a gate, holding a document, trying to look like a person who belongs. The prints don't show the clerk at the inn, yawning quietly as they write another name. Memory prefers lantern light to ledger ink. It prefers scenery to procedure. It prefers the idea of freedom to the slow, paper-shaped truth of permission. And yet, the paper is where so much of the lived experience sits, in the folds, in the seals, in the careful phrasing, in the little lies told politely to keep everything smooth. If you hold the scene gently, hold a travel pass in your mind the way you might hold a thin letter, something light, but oddly powerful. Imagine the texture of the paper, slightly rough. Imagine the smell of ink that has dried but still feels present. Imagine the sound of the seal pressing down, that soft, decisive tap. Imagine the way a traveler might check the document again and again, not because they forgot what it says, but because they want to reassure themselves it still exists. Then let the road keep going, as it always does, through rain that makes the stones shine, through wind that makes the trees whisper, through towns that smell like soy and smoke and wet straw. Let the checkpoints remain where they are, patient and unavoidable. Let the inn registers fill up page by page, as calm as snowfall. Let the whole system continue doing what systems do, turning messy human movement into tidy lines. And if you're getting sleepy now, you don't have to reach any destination at all. You can just drift with the rhythm, question, answer, stamp, fold, walk until the details blur, and the paper in your mind becomes as weightless as it always wanted to be, and the road quietly disappears under your thoughts. You might not expect a city to keep a diary about what is happening under its own feet, but cities can be surprisingly sentimental about infrastructure, especially when the infrastructure smells like damp stone, old soap, and a kind of patient darkness. Tonight, we were going to drift through a very quiet subject that once felt extremely important to people who enjoyed not stepping into surprise puddles. We're going into the 19th century Paris sewers, not for drama, not for danger, but for the sleepy paperwork, inspection logs, stamps, numbered lanterns, and the slow, polite routines that tried to make an underground world behave. If you're still awake by the time I reach the part about how an inspector might measure a tunnel with something as glamorous as a stick, you can subscribe. Or don't. No pressure. The sewers will not be offended. They have endured far worse than indifference, and they rarely leave comments. To enter this story properly, imagine a city that is learning to think of itself as a system. Streets on top, pipes beneath, people moving like water more or less in lines. In 19th century Paris, the sewers were not just a place where things disappeared. They were increasingly a place where things were managed. And management is one of history's most reliable sedatives. Management brings forms, schedules, rotations, and polite arguments about whose responsibility it is to carry a ladder. Management also brings a special kind of optimism, the belief that if you write something down, the universe will behave better. Down in the tunnels, the air is cool and stubborn. Sound travels strangely, as if the stone wants to keep your voice for itself. The light comes from lamps that do not feel romantic. They feel practical. A lamplight underground is not meant to look pretty. It is meant to keep you from stepping into the wrong channel. And already, in that simple purpose, you can sense the beginning of regulation. Someone decides where the lamps go. Someone decides how often they're checked. Someone decides how much oil is issued and to whom, and in what container, and whether the container must be returned. It's hard to feel wild and free when your illumination has a return policy. The first quiet rule of the sewer is that it has to be mapped, because a place that is not mapped is a place that cannot be argued about efficiently. Paris began expanding and reorganizing its sewer system in ways that made it more legible, more navigable, and more, in a strange way, more bureaucratic. There were plans and diagrams. There are sections and names. A tunnel could be referred to like an address, which is a very calming transformation. When something has an address, you can pretend it is tame, even if it's full of damp air and echoes and the occasional drifting object that would prefer not to be identified. And then there are the inspections. Inspections are like bedtime stories, if bedtime stories were written by people who love clipboards. An inspector goes down with a lamp. An inspector checks the brickwork. An inspector looks for cracks, blockages, collapsed sections, and the slow, stubborn buildup of things that do not want to move. An inspector makes notes. The notes can be brief because brevity is the language of routine. Clear, needs cleaning, odor strong, water level high. Imagine writing odor strong in a tidy hand, then calmly going home to dinner as if that phrase is just part of a normal job. In a way, it is. Humans are wonderfully adaptable. We can normalize almost anything as long as it comes with a schedule. Sometimes the details get oddly specific. A blockage might be described by its material, which is both boring and faintly unsettling. A tunnel might be noted as slippery, which is the kind of understatement that deserves a medal. An inspection log might include the time, because time is what makes chaos feel organized. If you have ever felt calmer simply by setting a timer, you understand the psychology. The sewer is the same. The more you timestamp it, the less it feels like a living thing. No, because this is history, and history loves absurdity in small doses. There are also moments when the underground behaves like an uncooperative pet. Water does not always flow politely. Debris does not always go where it is told. And sometimes the city discovers that the sewer has its own weather changes and water level, temperature, and smell that do not care about anyone's plans. That is why inspections repeat. It's not because people forget, it's because reality keeps changing in slow, damp ways. And at street level, above this calm underworld, people mostly go on being people. They complain about taxes. They buy bread. They argue about politics. They walk over grates without thinking too hard about what the grate represents. This is another gentle rule of modern life. The more a system works, the less anyone wants to imagine it. The sewer becomes successful when it becomes invisible, which is a rather poetic fate for something that spends its time removing what we may rather not notice. After a while, though, you begin to see that the sewer is not only a place, it is a workplace. And workplaces have their own little economies of effort, reward, and quiet resentment. There are crews who clean, repair, and monitor. There are supervisors who want reports. There are supplies boots, lamps, oil tools, ropes that must be counted, replaced, and explained when missing. A missing rope is not a thrilling mystery. It is a paperwork problem. Someone asks, "Where's the rope?" Someone else says, "I thought you had the rope." The rope itself is probably sitting somewhere, quietly being a rope, unaware of the trouble it is causing. Payment and labor in these systems can be surprisingly structured. There are wages, there are shifts. There are rules about who goes where and when, because the underground does not reward improvisation. If you send the wrong people into the wrong tunnel with the wrong lamp, the tunnel will not politely correct you. It will simply remain a tunnel. And the workers, who are often the most sensible people in any system, develop practical habits that sound almost like rituals. Check the lamp. Check the boots. Don't step where you can't see the bottom. Don't lean on that wall because it looks tired. Take the same route back. Count the tools before leaving. Count them again because counting is comforting. There's also, quietly, the idea of responsibility as a kind of contract. If a section floods, who is accountable? If a blockage forms, who is supposed to inspect it? If a wall cracks, who noticed first? Bureaucracies love these questions because they turn physical reality into administrative reality. The water does not care who is accountable, but the office cares. And the office, in its soft way, can be more frightening than the water, because the office can take away your job while the water mostly just makes you wet. In some cases, there were structured systems for reporting and escalating issues, which is a phrase that sounds modern because it is modern. You can almost imagine an early version of submit a ticket, except the ticket is literal paper, and the submission involves walking it to someone's desk. A worker reports a problem, a supervisor signs, a higher official approves, materials are allocated, time is scheduled, the tunnel waits patiently while humans negotiate with each other about how to fix it. This is an ongoing theme of civilization. Stone and water remain calm while people argue about budgets. And because contracts are rarely just about work, money has a way of showing up even in the most unglamorous places. There are costs for repairs, costs for new brick, costs for maintenance, costs for lamp oil, which is a very quiet reminder that even light has a supply chain. Somewhere above ground, someone is purchasing oil. Someone is storing it. Someone is recording the amount issued. Someone is probably annoyed about spillage. And if you want a tiny micro hook of absurdity, imagine that there is a man whose job is essentially oil accountability for underground lamps. If that's not a bedtime job title, I'm not sure what is. There's also the subtle economy of reputation. Workers who do reliable inspections become trusted. Workers who miss things become talked about in the mild, slow way workplaces talk. Not loud gossip. Just the small comments that stick. He doesn't notice cracks. She's careful with the tools. He always comes back with the lamp still burning. Somehow, a sewer crew can become its own tiny village, just with more moisture and fewer flowers. Now, let's drift into the part where systems become systems in the full sense, where watching becomes normal. A managed underground requires oversight, because oversight is how management reassures itself that it exists. There are supervisors. There are inspectors of inspectors. There are standards, which are like lullabies made of numbers. How wide should a channel be? How high should the walkway be? How often should a section be checked? How quickly should a reported issue be addressed? Standards are comforting because they create a world where everything can be compared to an ideal, even if the ideal is mostly imaginary. Surveillance in this context is not dramatic. It is procedural. It is the slow insistence that everything be recorded. A report is filed. A report is reviewed. A report is stored. And storage itself becomes a kind of sleepy monument. Shelves of documents, stacks of logs, pages that smell faintly of ink and dust. Somewhere, a file exists that says, in a calm voice, on this date, this tunnel was considered acceptable. And the tunnel, of course, continues being a tunnel, doing tunnel things in silence. There are also rules for behavior underground, because any shared workspace eventually invents manners. Don't waste oil. Don't leave tools behind. Don't break the schedule. Don't take shortcuts that lead into unknown branches. Don't argue loudly because sound travels and makes the whole place feel haunted. Even when it's just two tired adults disagreeing about a bucket, discipline in these environments can include fines, reprimands, reassignment, and that deeply unpleasant punishment known as, you are now responsible for the worst section. Every workplace has a version of the worst section. In the sewers, it is simply more literal. And the public also becomes part of the system, even if the public doesn't realize it. People are told not to dump certain things. People ignore the instruction. The sewer receives the offering anyway. People complain when streets smell. Officials respond with new rules. The cycle continues. It's like a very slow conversation between the city and its residents, except the city speaks in regulations and the residents speak in questionable habits. Some of the most oddly modern moments come when you imagine the city trying to enforce cleanliness like a moral virtue. Cleanliness becomes civic pride. It becomes progress. It becomes something you can point to and say, we are advanced now. And then, inevitably, someone drops something large into the system, and the system quietly reminds everyone that humans are still humans. Progress is real, but it is fragile. It can be defeated by one stubborn blockage and a week of rain. If you want another soft micro hook, consider the idea that a sewer can become a tourist attraction. At various points, people have been fascinated by the underground because humans love seeing the backstage of their own lives. There is something both thrilling and hilarious about paying money to look at the place where waste goes. It's like visiting a museum exhibit titled Things We Pretend Don't Exist, and then buying a souvenir. A city can be very proud of its sewers, which is both sensible and faintly funny. Welcome to Paris, the city seems to say. We have bread, art, romance, and also, please admire our drainage. And then, slowly, we arrive at what the sewer leaves behind, not in the tunnels, but in memory. History often turns unpleasant systems into aesthetic systems. The underground becomes a symbol. Writers use it as a metaphor. Artists imagine it as a hidden mirror of society. And while metaphors are lovely, they also smooth out the boredom, which is where the real texture lives. The real texture is the inspection log, the timestamp, the list of supplies. The note that says, very simply, cleaned. It is hard to build a grand myth out of a line that says cleaned, because cleaned is a small word with a tired soul. Yet, the truth is that these boring routines change life more than many dramatic events. A functioning sewer means fewer diseases. A functioning sewer means less smell, less fear, less constant negotiation with filth. It means a city can grow bigger without collapsing under its own output. That's a huge impact achieved through deeply unglamorous work. Civilization is often built by people who never get statues because their tools were brooms, lamps, and a good sense of where water wants to go. And perhaps the most bedtime-friendly thought is that the sewer is a kind of quiet promise. A promise that the mess will be handled, not perfectly, not forever, but handled enough that you can sleep. Even if you never think about it, the system is there, below you, doing its slow work. Water moving, channels carrying, brick holding, logs filling with neat handwriting, lamps burning down in measured hours. A person somewhere in a small office filing a report about the condition of a tunnel you will never see. So if you want to end softly, imagine a single inspector finishing a round. Boot stamp, lamp low. Notebook filled with small observations that no one will read with excitement. The inspector climbs a ladder, a door closes. The street above continues with its ordinary noise. And down below, the tunnels remain, quietly existing, quietly waiting for the next inspection, the next stamp, the next calm line of ink that says, in the gentlest possible way, that the underground is still doing what it does, and the city can keep dreaming on top of it. A paper lantern breathes the way a patient thing breathes, not because it has lungs, but because warm air insists on moving. I get it taps on whetstone, once, then again, like punctuation you can hear. A sliding door clicks shut with the soft confidence of something that has done this all night, every night, for years. And just for a moment, before we get comfortable, I'll ask in a whisper, where and what time are you listening from? It's a little strange, when you think about it, that an entire city can decide to place its unofficial needs on one official street, and then act surprised when the street becomes famous. But humans love tidy arrangements. If you can put something behind a gate, you can pretend you've solved it. In early modern Japan, especially in places like Edo-licensed pleasure quarters were built like an answer the city didn't. To want to admit it had asked, with walls and controlled entrances that said politely contained. And containment as a concept is very soothing, even when it's mostly symbolic. You can feel your mind settling already, because walls mean rules, and rules mean routines, and routines mean someone, somewhere, is filling out the world like a ledger. Imagine approaching the gate slowly, not dramatically. No suspense. just the quiet fact of an entrance that tells you where you're allowed to be. Outside the gate is the ordinary city: errands, rice shops, water buckets, small arguments, large silences. Inside the gate is a street that operates like a business pretending to be a dream. That dream is not chaotic. It is administrative. It has hours, policies, and a kind of controlled glow. The lanterns don't mean disorder. They mean oversight. They mean that nighttime has been given a schedule and a price list, like anything else a city wants to monitor. The first sleepy thing to notice is how much of this world is paperwork wearing perfume. You enter, you are seen, you are counted in some quiet way. Rules replace improvisation. Who may enter, when doors close, how disputes are handled, what is forbidden in daylight, what is tolerated at night, and what is considered bad for business, which is one of the gentlest moral categories ever invented. If something threatens profit, it is suddenly very important. If it threatens dignity, the system may shrug. This is not a shocking insight, it is just a slow one. And because systems love naming, the quarter organizes people the way a library organizes books, except the shelves are human expectations. Names, ranks, and distances become the real merchandise. You don't just pay for a moment. You pay for the right kind of moment, delivered at the right level, with the right amount of unattainability included. People are sorted into ranks because rank controls access, and access controls money. A high-ranking courtesan can be marketed as art music, poetry, conversation, so the client pays for time, not just touch. And time is always the easiest thing to invoice because it passes whether you enjoy it or not. Distance becomes a product on purpose. The more unreachable someone is, the more valuable the illusion becomes. Even the way you speak, bow, and wait is part of what you are buying. The waiting is important. Waiting is the velvet rope of the historical imagination. It turns simple desire into something ceremonial and slow, like standing outside a bakery at dawn and insisting the bread tastes better because you suffered a little for it. Humans adore that logic. We build entire cultures out of it. If you're still awake during all this quiet gate thinking, feel free to subscribe. Or don't, I'll never know. The lanterns won't report you. They have enough work already, glowing politely and pretending the world is simple. Now let's drift deeper into the softer machinery, where elegance is supported by something far less elegant: debt. Debt is one of history's most reliable leashes, mostly because it doesn't need to raise its voice. In the pleasure quarters, behind the surface of soak and practiced smiles, debt moves quietly, because debt is easier to enforce than violence, and it leaves fewer visible marks. Clothes, hairpieces, lessons, lodging, cosmetics, everything can be counted, written, and added to a ledger. And the ledger is a very calming object. It's just paper. It doesn't look cruel. It looks organized. A person can appear adored while being trapped because the beauty is part of the bill. In that math, freedom is not a feeling, it is a number. And numbers are stubborn, they sit there. They don't respond to pleading. They don't get tired, they simply remain. It's almost comforting in an abstract way how committed numbers are to being themselves. The night also runs on agreements that don't always like to be spoken to loudly. Rules govern meetings the way ritual governs prayer, scheduling, chaperones, approved rooms, and who speaks to whom first. Even conversation has a shape. Even laughter has a boundary. Clients carry expectations, status, secrecy, rivalry, and the quarter turns those expectations into predictable profit. This is where the system becomes strangely modern. It sells not only services, but feelings. Or rather, it sells the performance of feelings, which is much easier to standardize. Promises are made in soft language: patronage, exclusivity, rescue, future plans that keep someone hoping. And hope can be a contract too, even when nothing is signed. Hope is especially efficient because it feels voluntary. It feels like a choice. But it can also be managed like inventory, offered carefully, measured, withheld, returned in small doses. If you've ever refreshed a message thread and told yourself, maybe later, you already understand the smallest version of this. The mind is easy to lease when it's tired, and yet, because we're staying gentle, there is also real skill here. Artistry, training, performances that require memory, discipline, and a calm face at the end of a long night. The quarter isn't only transaction, it is also craft. But craft inside a system is still a system. A musician can be brilliant and still be scheduled. A poet can be sharp and still be priced. A conversation can feel intimate and still be timed, like a tea kettle that knows exactly when to stop singing. Now the next quiet layer arrives, and it arrives like a manager standing in a doorway, not angry, just present. Surveillance, not dramatic surveillance. No thrilling spies. Just a house that watches its own, because watching is cheaper than rescuing. The quarters feel private, but they are full of eyes. Managers, attendants, guards, neighbors who listen for trouble. A reputation can be controlled through gossip, because gossip is a low-cost police force. It requires no uniforms. It travels for free. It also has a better memory than people think. Breaking rules brings consequences that aim to restore profit, not justice fines, confinement, reassignment, public shame. These punishments don't need to be cruel every day. They only need to be unavoidable. That as the sleepy genius of a well-run system, it doesn't chase you with drama. It waits for you with procedure. Procedure is more patient than any person. And the client, too, is controlled, which is one of the more amusing details if you like your irony soft and quiet. Not every rule protects workers. Not every rule protects clients. Most protect the business itself. Fights, unpaid taps, kidnapping attempts, threats, anything that disrupts commerce is managed fast, because money hates unpredictability. Even powerful men can be turned away if they disturb the balance the quarter depends on. The Lantern Street offers pleasure, yes, but it also offers boundaries, enforced by people who know the alleyways better than you do. It's almost peaceful, in a strange way, how many lives are shaped by who is allowed to stand where, who can enter, who must wait, who must bow first, who gets to leave. The system doesn't need to shout. It simply arranges the furniture of behavior until everyone sits where they're told. If you ever felt oddly calm in a place with clear rules like a quiet library, you know the feeling. Of course, this is not a library. But the human brain responds to structure in the same sleepy way. Structure reduces decision-making. Decision-making is tiring. The quarter for everyone involved is an engine for turning messy desire into predictable steps. And then, because history also likes to wrap things in pretty paper, we come to what the lantern light leaves behind. Not the whetstone, not the ledgers, not the small daily negotiations. What remains in memory is often the beauty first. Songs, prints, fashion, famous names, romantic rescues that read better than accounting. The story people prefer is the story where the lantern glow is warm and the gate is just a charming detail, like a decorative frame around a painting. But the truth is mixed. Real skill, real relationships, real artistry, inside a system that could still be a trap. History often keeps the lantern glow and forgets the lock on the gate. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's just laziness. Myth is easier to remember than maintenance. A woodblock print can be hung on a wall. A debt ledger cannot. A poem fits in the heart. A contract fits in a drawer. And drawers are where complicated truths go to nap. So if we want to hold the scene gently, we can hold both at once without tightening our grip. Rain on wood. Warm paper light. Music carried through a corridor like steam. A little laughter, controlled but real. Footsteps that know where not to step. And then, quietly, we can hold the ledger too. Numbers, obligations, a life priced in installments. A door that doesn't open both ways, not as a shock, not as a moral lesson with bright edges. Just as another fact of how humans build worlds. They decorate the room and then charge rent for standing in it. Tomorrow, if you tell this story, let it stay calm without becoming sweet. Beauty and control can share the same room. They often do. The lanterns dim, the street quiets. The contracts remain, folded neatly where daylight won't look too hard. And somewhere, a gate sits in the dark, doing what gates do best, being very still, very patient, and very confident that, in the end, most of history is simply people learning how to organize each other, and then getting sleepy inside the organization. A small pond can feel like nothing at all, just a dark patch of water behind a stone wall, the kind of quiet place you'd walk past without noticing. But sometimes the most organized parts of history are the parts that look the least dramatic. A fish pond doesn't shout, it doesn't wave flags. It just sits there, collecting rain, collecting leaves, collecting the slow decisions of people who really wanted their dinner to be predictable. And that is how we end up in one of the gentlest, strangest corners of medieval life, the monastery fish pond, where holiness, hunger, and accounting learn to share the same damp air. Before you picture anything grand, picture something smaller. A courtyard, a hedge that needs trimming, a wooden bucket that always smells faintly like yesterday. Monasteries in medieval Europe often kept fish ponds because the calendar itself was hungry. There were fast days, and then more fast days, and then days that were technically not fast days, but still felt a little suspicious if you got too enthusiastic with meat. Fish became the obedient loophole, not always because anyone was trying to cheat. Sometimes it was just because people were trying to live inside a rule without going faint. It's difficult to prey on an empty stomach, and it's also difficult to farm your own morality when you're dizzy. So the pond becomes a kind of edible schedule. It turns faith into a resource you can count. You can stock it. You can harvest it. You can plan it. And planning is the most soothing activity humans have ever invented. Planning is the warm blanket of the mind. It tells you the future will arrive politely, on time, and in the correct portion size. If you listen closely, the pond has its own small soundtrack. A drip from a gutter. A frog that is not part of the plan, but behaves as if it is. A monk's sandal on wet earth. No applause, no climax. Just the sound of daily life being kept from falling apart by steady hands and slightly grim patience. Now, because this is history, the calm surface hides a lot of decisions. What kind of fish? Where does the water come from? How do you keep the pond from becoming a fancy puddle full of regret? Some places favored carp because carp tolerate boredom very well, which makes them an excellent partner for monastic life. Some raised eels, which is a bold choice because eels always look like they were trying to escape the concept of being held. And some ponds were less about fresh fish whenever you want, and more about fish whenever God and weather allow, which is most of medieval economics in one sentence. The funny part is how quickly this turns into an unofficial science. Water level, shade, mud, feed. A pond is a living thing that pretends to be furniture. And to keep it alive, you need attention, not romantic attention, not passionate attention, administrative attention. The kind that notices when the water smells different, or when the surface is too still, or when you see a suspicious ripple at the wrong time. In a monastery, even ripples can feel like they're due for review. And because humans can't resist ranking anything that moves, fish develop status too. A big, clean carp is practically a respectable citizen. A skinny one is an unfortunate complication. Eels become mysterious, pike become dangerous. And somewhere in the background, someone is deciding which fish belongs on which table, and whether it counts as a proper meal, and whether anyone is allowed to look too pleased about it. You can almost hear the internal debate. Yes, it's fish, but should it be enjoyed? Medieval life loved that question the way modern life loves asking whether a snack counts as dinner. If you're still awake as we stare into a pond and think about moral portion sizes, you can subscribe. Or don't. It's fine. The fish won't judge you. They're busy being quietly edible. Once you have a pond, you have a responsibility, and responsibility loves paperwork. The pond needs maintenance. The banks need repair. The water needs managing, which is a polite way of saying you have to stop it from turning into swamp soup. And in many monasteries, the fish pond wasn't just a side hobby. It became part of the house's survival strategy, tied to kitchens, guest hospitality, and the monastery's reputation for being properly run. Even charity has logistics. Especially charity. Feeding the poor is holy, but feeding the poor every week requires a system that doesn't collapse when it rains. So the pond starts to attract allies, gardeners, cooks, lay workers, local suppliers, sometimes even nearby landlords who have opinions about water rights, because water is never just water. Water is power that happens to be wet. A pond needs channels and drains. It needs someone who understands that if you block a small ditch in spring, you might lose half your fish by summer. And losing fish is not only a food problem, it is an embarrassment problem. Medieval institutions were very sensitive to embarrassment. It's why they wrote so much down. If it's written down, it feels controlled. You can imagine a small ledger somewhere not glamorous, maybe bound in rough leather where someone has noted the pond. As conditioned like it as a member of the community. Water low, fish small, repairs needed, net borrowed, net return late, which is the kind of drama that feels enormous when your world is mostly silence. Monastic drama tends to be practical. It's not usually sword fights. It's someone misplacing the net. And of course, there is the delicate matter of theft, because fish are the kind of resource that makes people creative. A pond looks like public property if you're hungry enough. It is very hard to guard something that is quiet and outdoors and technically just sitting there. So you get small rules. When fishing happens, who is present, who holds the baskets, who locks the gate, and suddenly the pond is not just a pond. It's an institution with a security policy. Here is a sleepy detail that feels almost modern. Ponds sometimes functioned like inventory buffers. If a harvest failed, fish could soften the blow. If a visitor arrived unexpectedly, an official, a patron, a traveling dignitary fish could appear as a respectable meal that didn't break the rules. The pond becomes a way to keep the monastery's public face smooth. And public faces are expensive. They require planning and fish, and occasionally pretending that everything has always been fine. There's also a social layer because monasteries didn't float in the sky. They sat among villages, fields, and local politics. Some houses traded fish, some rented fishing rights. Some accepted fish as part of rent or dues. And at that point, the pond has joined the economy, which is a fancy way of saying it now has arguments attached to it. Someone will always disagree about who is allowed to take what and when. The pond quietly becomes a place where spiritual life meets the sticky fingers of the ordinary world. Now we drift into the part that is surprisingly strict for something so calm: discipline. A monastery is a place built on rules, and rules do not become gentler just because you add water. There is supervision because supervision is how institutions keep their own shape. The pond is watched not with paranoia, but with routine. Managers, attendants, senior monks, whoever is responsible for provisions are not watching because they crave control like a villain. They are watching because if you don't watch, you run out. And if you run out, you become dependent. Independence in medieval life is rarely comfortable. Gossip helps here too, in a very low-cost way. If someone is seen near the pond at the wrong time, the story travels. If a basket seems too heavy, the story travels. If a cook suddenly has more fish than expected, the story travels. Gossip is the pond's invisible fence. It makes a quiet place feel less available. And gossip is incredibly efficient because it doesn't require a budget. It runs on human boredom, which is always abundant. And then there are punishments, which in this setting are less about drama and more about restoring order. Extra duties, loss of privileges, public correction. Sometimes the punishment is simply being watched more closely, which is a very monastic form of discomfort. The system doesn't need to be cruel every day. It only needs to be unavoidable. That sentence could have been carved over a great many medieval doorways, and it would have fit. But the discipline isn't only about theft, it's also about appetite. A fish pond makes it possible to have a meal that is technically allowed and still feels like a treat. And monasteries were always wrestling gently with that. Not because pleasure is evil in every medieval mind, but because pleasure is slippery. It's like an eel. It looks manageable until it isn't. So you get rules about portions, about when fishing happens, about whether fish is reserved for certain days, about whether guests get better fish than the community, which is an awkward question when your entire identity is supposed to be humility, yet you still want patrons to leave impressed. There is also the quiet tension between spiritual ideals and physical labor. Maintaining a pond is work. Draining it is work. Moving fish is work. Repairing banks is work. And work in monasteries is part of holiness, but it's also exhausting. And exhaustion can make people grumpy, and grumpiness can make rules feel louder. So you can imagine the smallest conflicts. Someone claims the pond schedule was misunderstood. Someone claims the baskets were counted wrong. Someone insists the carp were smaller last year, and another person insists the carp have always been this size, and the only thing that changed is your expectations. These tiny disputes are not thrilling. They're soothing, actually, because they're so human. They remind you that even in places built for quiet, people still negotiate the world through routine friction. The pond sits there absorbing it all, as if water can store complaints the way it stores reflections. And now, very gently, we come to what remains in memory. When people think about monasteries, they tend to picture stone walls, chanting, candlelight, illuminated manuscripts, and a general sense of calm seriousness. They don't usually picture a muddy pond full of carp that someone has to feed on a Tuesday. History likes the parts that look like art. It forgets the parts that look like maintenance. But maintenance is where most life actually happens, because life is mostly keep this going, repeat it forever. The pond, in its quiet way, is a reminder that institutions survive through boring competence. A monastery might preserve books and prayers, but it also preserves itself by managing food, and food is a form of peace. It prevents arguments, it prevents panic, it prevents the mind from becoming too loud. You could almost say the pond is part of the monastery's sleep strategy, except it's for an entire community, not one person listening late at night. There's also an odd kind of poetry in the idea that spiritual life depends on water management. That holiness is supported by ditches and drains and nets that have to be mended. It makes the past feel less distant. If you've ever tried to be your best self while also dealing with a leaking faucet, you already understand the principle. The soul may aspire upward, but the kitchen still wants dinner. So if we hold the image softly, we can hold both layers at once. The lantern of a chapel, the quiet breath of chanting, and then behind a wall, a pond that smells like mud and patience. A net lifted slowly, fish flashing briefly like a small, slippery form of proof that planning worked. Someone counts them. Someone notes it down. Someone feels relieved, not proud, just relieved. And then the water settles again, becoming plain water, pretending nothing happened at all, while the night continues the way nights do unhurried, repetitive, and full of small systems doing their best to keep the world from wobbling too much. You might not expect an entire city to run on buckets in polite silence, but in Edo, Japan, there was a time when one of the most carefully managed resources was very quietly the thing everyone was trying to get rid of. Not gold, not silk, not even rice, but what happens after rice. the part of the meal that leaves the body, and then, with a little paperwork and a surprising amount of calm cooperation, returns to the fields as fertilizer. It's the kind of economy that doesn't get heroic paintings, mostly because nobody wants to hang a portrait of a man negotiating over a barrel in the rain. But it is deeply real, deeply organized, and oddly soothing once you accept that history has always been practical first and romantic later. So imagine the city at night when the lanterns are low and the wooden streets feel softer underfoot. A sliding door closes, a small cartwheel creaks. Somewhere a bucket lid taps once like punctuation. The work is quiet on purpose. Nobody needs fanfare for something so ordinary. And yet this ordinary thing is treated like an asset because farming on the other side of the city depends on it. In a world without modern fertilizers, nutrients don't magically appear. They have to be moved, which means they have to be collected, which means eventually they have to be priced, scheduled, and argued over in the gentlest possible tone so that everyone can keep pretending they are not, technically arguing about poop. One of the strangely comforting truths here is that Ito was not improvising. It was managing. Certain neighborhoods had routines, and certain routes became unofficially official, as if the city itself had decided politely that some things should be contained. Waste collection could be arranged by landlords, by neighborhood groups, by people who understood that if you leave it to chance, chance becomes smelly. The city's order wasn't only about samurai and rules written in bold strokes. It was also about daily systems that kept the streets usable. In that sense, the night soil trade, as it's often called in English, is not a gross curiosity. It is urban planning with a slightly embarrassing face. And because it is planning, it immediately develops categories. Not all waste was valued the same, which is a sentence you never expect to say out loud until history forces you to. There were differences between households, between diets, between locations, and the people buying fertilizer cared about reliability the way modern people care about stable Wi-Fi. If you're a farmer, you don't want surprise. You want predictable input and predictable amounts at predictable times. The city, meanwhile, wants the collection to happen without chaos, without offense, without anyone dropping anything at the worst possible moment, which would turn an economic system into a neighborhood memory that never dies. If you are still awake while we discuss the quiet logistics of a resource everyone pretends not to notice, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. I will not chase you. I'm not fast. Also, this topic does not inspire sprinting. Now, it's tempting to imagine a single collector doing everything, like a lonely figure pushing a cart through mist. But most systems that actually work have middle layers. There are collectors, yes, but there are also the people who arrange access, the people who manage relationships, the people who make sure the right household's output ends up promised to the right buyer. The most stable economies are rarely dramatic. They are networks of people who are good at small agreements, repeated endlessly. In Ito, landlords often played an important role. A landlord didn't just provide a roof. A landlord often managed the building as an economic unit, which includes the unglamorous parts. Tenants might pay rent in money, but the building also produced something that could be sold. It's hard to feel romantic about that, but it is oddly elegant in a cold accountant's way. This is where ranking sneaks in, as it always does. Not ranking in the sense of crowns and thrones, but ranking in the sense of who gets better service, who gets access, who gets the cleanest timing, who gets the most reliable collection. If you are a large household or a busy establishment, you generate more, which makes you more valuable to the buyers, which means you become more interesting to collectors. Suddenly, a humble back alley becomes part of a supply chain, and supply chains love hierarchy. Even if nobody says it out loud, everyone feels it. The more important the source, the more careful the schedule. The more careful the schedule, the less likely you are to have an unpleasant scene. And avoiding unpleasant scenes is one of the hidden goals of civilization. There is also the price of distance, because distance is always expensive, even when the cargo is not glamorous. A farmer closer to the city has an advantage. A farmer farther away needs more coordination. You can picture a map in someone else's mind. Not the official map with temples and bridges, but the practical map with routes, timings, and the places where a cartwheel always sticks because the wood is worked. Edo was full of knowledge like that quiet knowledge, passed between people who did not write poetry about it, but who could tell you exactly when a certain lane is empty enough to move a heavy load without being noticed. And now we drift into the strange softness of contracts. Because even here, especially here, debt can become a leash. A collector might advance something, a promise, a service, an agreement to handle a building regularly, and in return, the building's product is committed. Once committed, it is no longer just household waste. It is a promised commodity, which means it creates obligation, which means the household, through its landlord or through neighborhood arrangements, becomes tied into a relationship that can feel oddly binding for something so bodily and ordinary. Freedom, in this world, is not a feeling. It is a number on a ledger, and sometimes it is also a timetable. The timetables, by the way, would have been the most soothing part if you like order. The work needed to happen at times that kept the streets comfortable. It needed to avoid peak hours. It needed to slip between the visible lives of the city like a careful shadow. Rules, formal or informal, governed who went where, how disputes were handled, and how quickly problems were corrected. Nobody wanted chaos. Not the buyers, not the sellers, and definitely not the neighbors who had to keep walking past the same corner every day, pretending they could not smell what they could absolutely smell. And then there are the agreements no one wants to say out loud, which is most agreements, if we're honest. A farmer wants the best fertilizer but doesn't want to seem desperate. A landlord wants a good price but doesn't want to offend a collector who can easily choose a different building. A collector wants steady access but doesn't want to seem too eager. So they speak in soft language. They frame things as arrangements. They talk about regularity and proper handling. They use polite words, because polite words make practical life feel less blunt. Even hope becomes part of the contract. Hope that the schedule will hold. Hope that there will be no accidents. Hope that the neighbors won't complain. Hope that the crops will grow and make the whole awkward chain feel worthwhile. Once an economy is built on routine, it is also built on watching. The system feels private because so much of it happens in backspaces, at quiet times, behind doors. But it is full of eyes. Managers, attendants, neighbors who notice patterns. Gossip becomes a low-cost police force again, as it always does. If a collector skips a stop, people notice. If a cart arrives at the wrong time, people notice. If someone tries to take what is already promised to someone else, people notice. The city doesn't need to be cruel every day. It only needs to be unavoidable. The rules do not have to shout. They only have to be present. Breaking the rules brings consequences that aim to restore order, not necessarily justice in the modern heroic sense. The consequences might be fines, loss of access, public correction, or the quieter punishment of being refused the next time you ask for cooperation. In an interdependent city, refusal is powerful. It is the polite version of a wall. And most people, most days, prefer the smooth path of the expected routine. It's not that everyone is virtuous. It's that disorder is exhausting. What's also quietly fascinating is that not every rule protects the weakest people involved. Rules often protect the system itself. A neighborhood wants cleanliness. A landlord wants profit and reputation. A farmer wants nutrients. A collector wants stable work. The individual household might just want to sleep without thinking about it. The client in this case is almost everyone, because everyone is both producing and needing something. Even the most powerful residents of the city cannot opt out of having a body. They can only outsource the handling of its consequences. And outsourcing creates dependence, which means even status has limits when you're dealing with the universal problem of digestion. Sometimes the system's strangest comfort is how normal it becomes. After a while, people stop thinking of it as unusual. It is simply part of the city's breathing. Ricin crops out, quiet collections in between. It's like a very slow, very polite machine. The kind of machine that doesn't sparkle, but keeps life from collapsing. And that is, honestly, the whole point of boring history. The world is mostly kept together by things nobody wants to make a statue of. Later generations tend to remember the beauty first. Ida lanterns, woodblock prints, elegant streets. Carefully arranged seasons, and those memories aren't wrong, but they are edited. They keep the lantern glow and forget the quiet cart behind the alley. They remember the art and forget the maintenance. They remember the clean lines and forget the soft mess that had to be moved somewhere by someone on schedule in the rain. History often turns cities into paintings. Real cities are closer to ledgers, and yet it's worth holding the truth gently. This system can be seen as surprisingly sustainable, even a little clever in a calm, unshowy way. Waste became resource. The city fed the fields, and the fields fed the city. The loop wasn't perfect, nothing human is. But it was a loop, and loops are comforting because they imply continuity. They imply that tomorrow will arrive and be handled, not solved, just handled like a familiar chore. So if you want to end softly, imagine a narrow street after midnight. Rain tapping on wood. A paper lantern breathing light in slow pulses. A collector moving carefully, not hurrying, not making noise, just doing a job that is both ordinary and essential. Somewhere, a ledger waits to receive another small note. Somewhere, a farmer sleeps, not thinking about nutrients, trusting that the city will deliver what it has promised. Somewhere, a household closes its door and returns to its own quiet. The cartwheels fade, the street settles. The contracts remain folded neatly inside routines, hidden where daylight doesn't look too closely, and the city continues, calm and practical, as if it could keep repeating this gentle cycle forever. You might not expect a city to regulate romance with the same tone it uses for street repairs, but the lantern streets of Edo did exactly that, with rules that sound almost polite until you realize how firm they were. A paper lantern can glow warmly and still be an administrative object. It can be a mood and also a boundary. And if you listen closely, very closely, you can almost hear the paperwork breathing behind the music, like a second, quieter instrument that never stops playing. Imagine the first sound is small. A paper lantern shifts in a draft. A geta taps once on wet stone. Not dramatic, just accurate. A sliding door clicks shut with that soft certainty wooden buildings have. Someone clears their throat in a way that means, I am here and I am behaving. And somewhere, maybe in the back of your mind, the calm question returns. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? You don't have to answer out loud. The Lantern Street won't insist. It only insists on other things, because the first odd thing about the pleasure quarters is that they were not meant to be chaotic. That's the myth people bring with them, like a souvenir they never asked for. The reality is that these districts were built like controlled answers to needs the city preferred not to acknowledge directly. Walls, gates, schedules, and routines containment dressed up as nightlife. They weren't simply places where people wandered in and made choices. They were places where choices were shaped in advance. Who may enter when the doors close? What is forbidden in daylight? Which behavior counts as orderly? And which behavior becomes trouble very quickly? If you picture the gate, try not to picture it as dramatic. It's more like the entrance to a large, well-run building where everyone is pretending it's a little more spontaneous than it is. There's a threshold, and the threshold matters. It's the kind of threshold that changes your posture. On one side, you are in the city. On the other side, you are in a system. Even the lantern light feels different, not because the flames are special, but because the rules around the flames are special. The lanterns don't mean chaos. They mean administration nightlife that can be taxed, watched, and recorded, with the same quiet confidence used to record rice bales and roof repairs. Inside that system, names matter more than you would expect, and not only because names are pretty. Names are also a ranking mechanism that controls access. When you can't simply walk up to anyone you want, you learn quickly that distance can be sold. The more unreachable someone is, the more valuable the illusion becomes. And the illusion is not only about beauty, it's about procedure. How you speak, where you wait, how long you wait, how deeply you bow, how carefully you pretend not to care about the waiting. Even the act of waiting becomes part of what you're buying, which is quietly funny in a very modern way, because people still pay for waiting today, just with different apps and more irritated sighs. There is a small comedy in the ranks, too, because the ranks encourage people to behave as if they are experts in subtlety. Suddenly, everyone is a connoisseur of timing. Everyone is sensitive to tiny cues. Everyone can claim they came for poetry and conversation and the correct arrangement of small gestures, which is sometimes true and sometimes just a way of sounding less obvious. The quarter sells distance on purpose, and it sells it gently, so nobody has to admit they're purchasing a feeling. It is like buying a ticket to a museum and pretending you're not there for the gift shop. You're there for culture, of course. The fact that the culture comes with a bill is simply part of the tradition. If you're still awake while we talk about how a lantern street can behave like a spreadsheet, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. The lantern street will continue either way, and so will I, possibly forever, in a slow voice, describing procedures you didn't know you needed. Now, once you accept that this is a system, you start noticing what systems love most: obligations. An obligation in the pleasure quarters often wears the shape of debt. Debt moves quietly because it doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need swords. It doesn't even need anger. It needs arithmetic. Clothes, hairpieces, lessons, lodging, cosmetics, accessories that are small but never free. Everything can be counted, written, and added to a ledger with the soft scratch of a brush. A person can appear adored while being trapped because the admiration is part of the bill, and the bill is patient. The bill can wait. This is where the lantern glow becomes a little strange if you stare at it too long. The surface suggests ease. The underneath suggests a set of numbers that do not care about beauty. The math has no poetry. Or rather, the math becomes its own poetry, which is a very calm form of horror that doesn't need to be described loudly. Freedom in that world is not a feeling. It's a number, and it changes slowly, and everyone around you knows the number exists even if nobody says it directly. The softest trap is the one that looks like routine. And because debt is easier to enforce than violence, debt becomes a leash without looking like one. If you imagine a leash, don't imagine leather. Imagine paper. Imagine receipts. Imagine a ledger entry that quietly says you belong to a schedule. And schedules are powerful, especially in a district that runs on appearances. Appearances are not optional. Appearances are the business. Now we drift into the agreements nobody wants to say out loud, because the quarter is full of agreements, and most of them are designed to feel like they were never explicitly made. Rules govern meetings the way ritual governs prayer. Scheduling, chaperones, approved rooms, and the subtle choreography of who speaks to whom first. Clients also carry expectation status, secrecy, rivalry, and the quarter turns those expectations into predictable profit, the way a mill turns grain into flour, very quietly, very efficiently. You can almost hear it happening if the street goes silent for a moment. Promises, too, are made in soft language, patronage. Exclusivity, rescue, said gently, like it's a comforting blanket and not a marketing tool. Future plans that keep someone hoping. And hope can be a contract even when nothing is signed, which is one of the most bizarrely modern ideas in a pre-modern setting. Hope is a renewable resource. It can be stretched. It can be rationed. It can be sold as an atmosphere. You can walk under lanterns and feel hopeful without knowing exactly what you're hoping for, which is a skill humanity never really stopped practicing. But systems don't run on hope alone. They run on surveillance, which sounds harsh, but in practice often looks like ordinary people watching each other because it's cheaper than hiring someone official. The quarters can feel private, full of screens and corridors and controlled light, but they are also full of eyes managers, attendants, guards, and neighbors who listen for trouble. Reputation can be controlled through gossip because gossip is a low-cost police force that works even in sandals. And gossip has excellent memory. Gossip remembers what you did last season, last month, last night. Gossip does not need paperwork. It is living paperwork. Breaking rules brings consequences that aim to restore profit, not justice. And that's a very important difference if you like sleeping peacefully. Fines, confinement, reassignment, public shame, quiet removal from favor. The system does not need to be cruel every day. It only needs to be unavoidable. It needs to make sure everyone understands that the Lantern Street is not a wild forest. It is a garden with gates, and gardens are pretty precisely because they are controlled. There is, again, a mild absurdity in how calmly this control is maintained. A district built for pleasure is managed with discipline. A place designed for fantasy is built on structure. The lantern light can be warm, but the alleyways have boundaries enforced by people who know the rules better than you do. Even the client is controlled. Not every rule protects workers, and not every rule protects clients. Most protect the business itself. Fights, unpaid taps, kidnapping attempts, threats, bad behavior that scares away profit, these are managed fast. Not because the system is morally pure, but because the system hates disruption. If you want a modern analogy, it's like a nightclub with an excellent bouncer and an even better accountant. The bouncer removes the noise. The accountant removes the illusion that anything is free. And yet, despite all this control, the myth persists. Later generations remember the beauty first. Songs, prints, fashion, famous names, romantic rescues, the glow of lanterns reflected in rain. Memory is selective because it prefers comfort, and the lantern glow is more comfortable than a ledger. That doesn't mean the art is false. The art is real. The artistry is real. Skills are real. Relationships can be real. But they exist inside a system that can still be a trap. And history often keeps the lantern glow and forgets the lock on the gate. If you sit with that idea gently, without forcing it into a dramatic conclusion, it becomes oddly soothing in a quiet, unsettling way. Beauty and control can share the same room. Poetry and accounting can live in neighboring drawers. A person can be celebrated in public and restricted in private. A customer can feel powerful while being guided by rules they never bothered to learn. And the city, always the city, prefers arrangements that can be counted. The city doesn't fall asleep. The city keeps tally. So let's end the way the Lantern Street often ends, not with a grand finale, but with a slow fading of sound. Rain on wood. Warm paper light. Music carried through a corridor like steam, thin and persistent. Somewhere an attendant adjusts a screen. Somewhere a manager checks a list. Somewhere a brush makes a quiet mark on paper. Not angry, not emotional, just careful. The door doesn't slam. It clicks. The street doesn't roar. It breathes. The night doesn't resolve. It continues. And if you keep listening very softly, you can almost forget whether you're hearing a story or simply hearing a system humming along, calm and endless as the lanterns dim and the contracts remain folded neatly where daylight doesn't look too closely. A paper lantern does a small patient thing. It swells with light, then relaxes, as if breathing is part of its job description. A single geta taps on wet stone with the careful honesty of someone who does not want to slip. A sliding door closes with a soft click that feels more final than any loud slam ever could. And somewhere in that calm, practical darkness, there is a question you can keep like a warm coin in your pocket. Where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? You might not expect a place built for pleasure to be run like a filing cabinet, but the lantern districts of Edo had a deep affection for rules, gates, and paperwork that never raised its voice. If you imagine the entrance, try not to imagine a dramatic archway with trumpets. Think of something more ordinary and more effective, a boundary that changes how you stand, a gate that says, politely, inside is inside, a wall that says, quietly, outside is outside. In a city full of fires, noise, and human improvisation, the pleasure quarters were designed to be a contained answer to needs the city didn't want to discuss at breakfast. Containment doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like organization, a designated street for unofficial needs, made official by being placed in one spot, watched by the right people, taxed by the right offices, and surrounded by the right kind of certainty. The lanterns do not mean chaos. They mean administration. They mean a nightlife that can be recorded in a ledger with the same calm pen used for rice bales, roof repairs, and the occasional complaint about someone's dog. Inside those walls, rules replace improvisation in a way that feels almost soothing if you don't poke it too hard. Who may enter? When the doors close? How disputes are handled? What behavior counts as orderly? What is forbidden in daylight? Even the hours have opinions. The district has a rhythm that isn't quite natural because it's been adjusted by committees, shop owners, and officials who would rather deal with predictable problems than unpredictable ones. It is a bit like a modern city creating a designated area for something and then pretending the designated area makes the thing itself less real. It doesn't. It just makes it easier to supervise, which is a very comforting sentence for anyone who likes control and a very suspicious sentence for anyone who likes freedom. The gate also creates a kind of mood. Not a romantic mood necessarily, a procedural mood. The kind of mood you feel when you enter a place where someone will eventually ask your name, even if it's asked gently. The quarter is full of people who know who belongs where. They know which houses are allowed to do what. They know which tea house has which role. They know which small corridor leads to which larger corridor. And you, the visitor, are invited into this complexity, the way a person is invited into a large, polite system, warmly, but with limits. And then, once you're inside, the second thing the district sells becomes obvious. It sells distance. It sells ranking. It sells the idea that the more unreachable someone is, the more valuable the moment becomes when you are finally allowed to be in the same room. People are sorted into ranks because ranks control access, and access controls money, and money controls the ability to keep the lanterns lit without anybody getting too loud about how they repaid for. A high-ranking courtesan could be marketed as art, music, poetry, conversation, so the client pays for time, not just touch, and also pays for the feeling of being patient, cultured, and slightly overwhelmed. Even the way you speak becomes part of the transaction. The bow is not only a bow, it is a payment method and body language. The wait is not only a wait, it is a product. The district teaches people to treat waiting as meaningful, which is quietly funny because people still do that now, only with reservation apps and little spinning icons that say, loading. There's a sleepy absurdity to the careful distances, too. Everyone has to pretend the distance is natural, like the distance simply exists in the air, like humidity. But it is manufactured. The district sells it on purpose. The more unreachable someone is, the more valuable the illusion becomes. And the illusion can be complicated, layered, expensive, and beautifully rehearsed. The processions of a famous courtesan weren't only vanity, they were advertising and hierarchy put on legs. They were a moving announcement that said, "This person is not casual." Even the sound of sandals on stone can become a kind of branding. If you're still awake while we talk about branding through footwear, you can subscribe. Or don't. If you do subscribe, please do it in the spirit of the district, calmly, patiently, and with no sudden movements. If you don't, that's also fine. The lantern will continue to glow either way. Now, once you accept that the quarter sells distance, you start noticing the machinery that keeps distance stable. The machinery is not made of gears. It is made of obligations. And obligations in a place like this are often written in the quiet language of debt. Debt is the gentlest leash because it doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need swords. It doesn't even need anger. It needs arithmetic, and arithmetic is very patient. Behind elegance, debt moves quietly. Clothes, hairpieces, lessons, lodging, cosmetics, everything can be counted, written, and added to a ledger. The ledger is almost a character in the district, except it never speaks, and yet everyone obeys it. A person can appear adored while being trapped, because admiration is part of the bill. A silk kimono can be beautiful and also be a line item. A comb can be decorative and also be a monthly reminder that beauty has a price, and the price has interest, and interest has no interest in your feelings. There is something strangely modern about this if you let your mind drift toward subscription plans and small recurring charges. Except here the subscription is your life and the recurring charges are not optional. And the customer service line is basically the district itself. Debt can be enforced without violence because debt is enforced through structure, through who owns what, through who is allowed to leave, through who is expected to return. The trap is soft because it is normal, it is routine. It is paperwork in a pretty room. People sometimes speak of freedom in these settings, the way people speak of vacation when they are still answering emails. Freedom becomes a number. It becomes something you calculate. If you want to be bought out, if someone wants to pay to release you from your contract, that payout has its own name and its own price. And the price is high enough to keep the idea romantic without making it common. Even rescue can be processed. Even rescue can have a receipt. And because the quarter loves procedure, it also loves intermediaries. Not everything is said directly. In fact, much of what happens is designed to feel like it wasn't explicitly negotiated, because explicit negotiation ruins the illusion. So the district develops its own soft language. Promises made in half phrases. Invitations delivered through tea houses. Letters folded carefully, carried carefully, read carefully, and sometimes interpreted like sacred texts, even when they're basically scheduling. Rules govern meetings the way ritual governs prayer. Who introduces whom, which room is approved, who chaperones, who is allowed to linger, who is expected to leave before anyone has to ask them to. Clients arrive with expectations, status, secrecy, rivalry, and the quarter turns those expectations into predictable profit. It is a kind of gentle alchemy, turning hope into routine, turning desire into appointments, turning jealousy into a reason to spend more money without ever admitting that jealousy is what it is. Promises are made in soft language, patronage, exclusivity, future plans that keep someone hoping. And hope can be a contract too, even when nothing is shown, signed, or stamped. Hope is a renewable resource. It can be stretched thin and still look shiny. It can be fed with small gestures, small gifts, small delays that make everything feel like it's building towards something. Hope is not a villain here. Hope is simply useful. And what is useful is used. Now we drift very gently into the part of the district that feels less like a warm lantern and more like a quiet eye. Because a system that runs on hope and debt also runs on surveillance, but often looks like ordinary people watching each other. The quarters can feel private, full of screens and corridors and carefully controlled light. But they're full of observers, managers, attendants, guards, and neighbors who listen for trouble. A reputation can be controlled through gossip, because gossip is a low-cost police force that works even in sandals. Gossip doesn't need uniforms. Gossip doesn't need offices. Gossip needs time, and the district has plenty of time. If something goes wrong, the goal is rarely justice in the noble sense. The goal is restoration of order, which usually means restoration of profit. If a rule is broken, consequences are designed to make the system stable again. Fines, confinement, reassignment, public shame, quiet removal from favor. The system doesn't need to be cruel every day. It only needs to be unavoidable. It needs to teach everyone that the Lantern Street is not a wild forest. It is a garden with gates, and gardens are pretty precisely because someone keeps trimming the edges. There's a sleepy irony in how carefully a place of pleasure is managed. The district is marketed as an escape from ordinary life, but it contains a dense imitation of ordinary life's most persistent feature: social control. People watch each other. People judge each other. People keep track. The quarter makes this feel natural by making it constant, and constant things begin to feel like weather. You don't argue with weather, you just adjust your sleeves and walk. And then, of course, the client is controlled too, because uncontrolled clients are bad for business. Not every rule protects workers, and not every rule protects clients. Most protect the district itself. The district has to prevent chaos, not because it is morally pure, but because chaos interrupts commerce. Fights and unpaid tabs and threats and drunken behavior are not romantic. They are expensive, so they are managed quickly. A client can be turned away. A client can be discouraged. A client can be quietly corrected by people who know the alleyways better than the client ever will. Even the idea of gaining control is something the district sells while also containing it. A client might imagine they are purchasing power, but what they often purchase is a scripted feeling of importance inside a structure they did not design. It's like being given the best seat in a theater and thinking you own the play. You don't. You just have a very good seat, and the ushers are still watching the aisles. If you listen for the smallest details, you can hear how time itself is enforced. Appointments, curfews, the steady insistence that the night will end. The lanterns may glow as if the world is endless, but the district knows exactly when the gates close. And the district does not negotiate with dawn. Dawn is one of the few things that outranks everyone. Now, after all that, after gates, ranks, debt, intermediaries, surveillance, what remains in the mind is often not the ledger. It's the glow. Later generations remember the beauty first. Songs, prints, fashion, famous names. Romantic rescues, the softly dramatic rain and woodblock images where everyone looks composed and slightly tragic in an aesthetically pleasing way. The memory is clean because memory likes clean things. It's easier to frame a lantern than to frame a contract. This doesn't mean the art is fake. The artistry is real. The skill is real. Music, poetry, conversation, performance. These are not illusions in the cheap sense. They are real human effort, real training, real craft. Relationships can be real too, in the way human relationships always insist on existing, even inside systems that try to control them. But reality here sits inside a structure that can still be a trap. And history often keeps the lantern glow and forgets the lock on the gate because the lock is less photogenic. There's a quiet comfort in admitting this without forcing it into a dramatic moral. Beauty and control can share the same room. Poetry and accounting can live in neighboring drawers. A person can be celebrated in public and restricted in private. A customer can feel powerful while being guided by rules they never bothered to learn. And the city, always the city, prefers arrangements that can be counted. The city doesn't fall asleep. The city keeps tally. So let us end the way the Lantern Street ends most nights. Not with a grand conclusion, but with a soft thinning of sound. Rain taps on wood. Warm paper light makes the corridor look kinder than it is, and also somehow kinder than it needs to be. A distant shamisen line drifts like steam and then vanishes into the architecture. Somewhere, an attendant adjusts the screen with the care of someone folding cloth. Somewhere, a manager checks a list and makes a small mark with a brush. Not angry, not emotional, just precise. The door doesn't slam, it clicks. The street doesn't roar, it breathes. And then little by little, the lanterns dim. The gate becomes more than a symbol again. It becomes a piece of wood that closes. Footsteps spread out, soften, and finally disappear. The district goes quiet in the way a system goes quiet when it is satisfied. Everything returned to its place, everything recorded enough, everything contained enough. The contracts remain folded neatly where daylight won't look too closely. The ledger rests like a sleeping animal that will wake again without effort, and the night, instead of ending, simply steps backward into itself, calm and endless, as if the city could keep this gentle bureaucratic glow going forever.